Let's remember the only normal people are people you don't know very well. And once you get to know another human being, not for who they should be, but for who they are, and once you get to know yourself, not for who you should be, but for who you are, it's difference that constitutes our humanity.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Idioms of Normality. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Mason, and this is a podcast series on Future Framed TV, the collective podcast series of Traces&Dreams. And I'm joined today with an incredible interviewee, Jonathan Mooney, the author of a few books now, but this is by far the one I know the best, which is Normal Sucks. Jonathan Mooney, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Paul, thanks for having me on your important show here.
And tell me, what experiences bring you to writing a book about normality? What brings you to this question or this topic?
Why such a subtle title is probably your second question. Look, I come to this, very much from a personal perspective. I come from it, and I come to the topic and the idea and really the social movement that's embodied by resisting normal. I come to it because, I myself found myself on the wrong side of normal. I was the kid who struggled tremendously in school. I spent a lot of the time chilling out with the janitor in the hallway. I grew up on a first name basis with Shirley, the receptionist in the principal's office. I didn't learn to read until I was 12. I was eventually diagnosed as, being not normal, diagnosed with a continuum of sort of language-based learning disabilities, executive functioning, attentional problems. And I struggled. And I had a journey of transformation that had much to do with understanding and then subsequently resisting that notion that there's a normal human being that we should all aspire to be.
Amazing. And then you've gone on to write books drawing on Michel Foucault, Margaret Mead, some incredibly difficult readers to writers to get through. And I'm not going to derail us. I really want to jump in with this question. What is normal?
Well, I mean, first of all, Discipline and Punish is a light read, man. I mean, that's like that's a beach read, man. Look, that question of what is normal, who is normal, is really the heart of the book, of course, but really the heart of that personal journey that I referred to, and personal journey of healing and transformation, wrestling with that construct and that question, and so that question is a two-sided coin. On one hand, what is normal? The answer is, what is normal is a social construct that we have decided to impose on others. I think Ian Hacking said it best when he said, the word normal, the concept of normal, names what is in the world, but also what is right or should be. And that's a paraphrase. And I think that construct and that duality of naming what occurs in the world as an objective fact, but then at the same time conflating an objective fact with an ideal of a human, an ideal of another person, of an ideal of an experience, is the essence of normality. And I think nothing embodies that better than what is our operative notion of normality, which is, the normal person is the white, upper middle class, able body, able mind, straight person with 2.5 kids, right? And it's that 0.5 that really gets us back to the construct of normality, because I don't know about you, but I've never met 0.5 kids in my life, right? Like that's a statistical construct, right? It's something that can't exist in the world, but yet we hold that notion of the normal human deeply in our institutions and in our language and in our psyche in many ways. And it was extricating myself from that idea, specifically that idea of the normal learner in an educational context, that was healing and transformative for me.
And I find it's even when the word is unspoken, that it has been written into our social structures in ways that can be really difficult to recognize.
Yeah, unspoken and taken as fact, right? You know, when we take normality as a fact in the world, opposed to a construct that's created, then we're at the most risk of perpetuating deeply ingrained bigotry, deeply ingrained hatred, and deeply ingrained marginalization of folks who fall outside the middle of the bell curve. Normal as a design principle, you know, as a design principle of schools, design principle of built environment, design principle of community, design principle of places of work and commerce. It's the unspoken prioritization of normality, opposed to the reality of human difference, that is the most dangerous.
Yeah. I think it was Francis Galton who coined the phrase standard deviation. And a lot of people don't know that the word standard comes from this battle term for stand hard, which was the flag bearer in battles. And if they let go of the flag, then they were betraying their country. They were betraying their countrymen in battle. And it's really is a word of violence. And to deviate from your stand hard was to deviate from what was being a good national citizen. And I think Francis Galton also thought that had the Greeks found the normal distribution, they would have worshipped it like a god. I think that's something he said. And the more I look around, and as an anthropologist, I look at people and I observe them with that anthropological lens. And even though the word God isn't there in their practices, in their rituals, in their taboos and their totems, I can see that there is a worship of normality as well.
Yeah, I think we beat the Greeks to it. There is a worship of normality, whether it takes on deistic forms or not. It is deeply ingrained in our language, culture, and psychology that to deviate from the standard bearer is dangerous. And I think that's a really insightful part of linguistic history, where, you know, the way we talk informs how we act, and the cultural origins of words like standard bearer, normality, they matter. And what an astute insight that you shared a moment ago, that notion of, you know, standard deviation, the notion of a standard, was always linked with warfare and national risk. Because I think when we worship normality at its highest, certainly in the United States, at least, where, you know, I'm speaking and where I write from, and the cultural context that I live in, it was a sort of nation at risk by the deviants coming from all corners, right? Coming from European immigration, coming from emancipated Black folks here in this country. It's those sort of threats, you know, sort of troops at the gates, in which the eugenics movement sort of rose to highest prominence, you know. And what did Francis Galton hold out? the father, whatever you want to call him, patriarch of the eugenics movement, you know, it was fight against deviance at all costs.
And again, we return to that idea that even though we've got rid of eugenics, and in rhetoric, we recognize that eugenicists were wrong and that the practice of eugenics is unjust and unfair and inhumane, we still find a lot of that coding of normality and standard deviation in our social structures, in our educational structures, in job, you know, profile applications, etc. You know, people are looking for normality. They want to find normality. They hire normality. They reward normality. In some ways, to continue that God discussion, the standard deviation is a bit like the trickster God, because to deviate can be a bad thing, but it can also be a good thing. And so it can also be a strength. It can be a source of innovation. So I've got a tricky question for you now. How do you resist normal?
First of all, just to backtrack for a second, I don't know if the folks over at CRISPR, the gene editing technology, got the memo that eugenics was out. Like, I think those folks are squarely kind of on the path towards figuring out how we edit out mutation at the genetic level, and that is stated scientific goals in many of the sort of emerging genetic engineering technology that is being funded to the tune of billions of dollars of venture capital funds and beyond. It's a little known fact that the vast majority of eugenic programs, in which there were hundreds at Harvard and beyond in the heyday of American eugenics at the very least, but that really was the heyday of international eugenics, that most of those eugenic departments converted to become genetic departments. And so that sort of core epistemological lens of standard deviation, of norms and norming, is deeply embedded in that academic discipline in particular. And I worry, because a lot of my work as an activist it sits within the disability rights context, because of my own experience of having difference pathologized and considered a problem within me. Many of the disability rights community look down the horizon and ask, a future dominated by norms in which we think eugenics is behind us just because we don't use the word, but we're still using the sort of core concepts, in which the deviations that do add value to the world, and deviation, diversity, period, adds value to the world, whether or not there's innovation or creativity. It is what constitutes being human. Worry that there are many folks who are endangered species in that sense. And we're seeing intentional attempts to reduce neurodiversity, physical diversity, in the same way that we're seeing, rapacious consumer capitalism, deplete biodiversity, right? And so those two sort of systems and those two forces, I think, share a conceptual center, and that conceptual center is what deviates from normal is deficient, not different. And so that gets to the question that you raised, and it's a little bit of an obtuse way to answer your question, which is, resisting requires recognizing and reframing. When we think of normal as a fact in the world that somebody discovers, then if you deviate from it, well, it's your problem. You're not holding up to the standard. And when we reframe it as not a fact in the world that's discovered, but as a construct that's created by powerful systems, often with an economic imperative behind them, and really deeply bigoted systems, then the problem's not you. The problem's not your kid. The problem's not your colleague. The problem is this myth that we have taken as fact. That's the problem. And then subsequently, not just the problem of normality as a notional social construct, but the systems that have been designed to enforce normal, ranging from the school system to the mental health system to the workplace and everything in between. So when we reframe, and we can resist, because we're not the problem. The problem is a world designed around the idea that we should all be the same.
I totally agree with you that the branding of eugenics may have been discarded, but the ideas remain, and they've become these very influential concepts that have structured entire systems that we work within, whether we're students at a school or employees in a corporation. We are subscribing to and perpetuating normality unless we reframe it, and unless we, in your words, recognize it and reframe it. And I think that's a really useful toolkit, because resisting normal can feel like it's a personal, individual problem, and that can put an incredible burden on an individual, can't it?
It is a burden, and it's at the most micro level, it's a burden that I try to support and encourage folks to bear, because otherwise you fall under the weight of it. Folks who have been labeled deficient have to come to the place of seeing themselves as different. and not deficient. And that's the shift. Now that shift can't happen alone, and that shift can't happen solely within individuals. It has to be a systemic shift, but we all need to support folks who are carrying that weight in resisting it and finding a new sense of self.
You describe that moment for you in your book where you realize that I'm trying to find the page in your book where you recognized that you were special not despite your differences, but because of your differences. And it was a really nice way of distilling it. And since that moment, you've gone on to share your insights about disrupting normality, resisting normality with other people. Can you share with us what that process has been like, to see other people wake up or to plant that seed in other people and help them to recognize that resisting normality is going to offer them a possibility of a new world, of a different world?
My work over 2 decades has been driven by that pay it forward, because of the moments in which others in my life sort of turned the gear and reframed and helped me resist. There's 2 moments in particular that you're referring to. And I think they're really good examples of the interdependent nature of resistance. You can't do it alone. you do it together, right? And one was, in my early 20s, when I was, really struggling with mental health issues and depression and anxiety and the beginnings of some substance abuse struggles. And I was seeing a therapist, and in the conversation with the therapist, at some point I said, well, yeah, I have, problems with my dyslexia. And the therapist stopped and said, I don't know. I think you have problem with other people's dysteachia. Because dyslexia puts the problem in me, and dysteachia puts the problem in the systems around me. And what a powerful moment of reframe, and what an eye-opening of like, yeah, you know what? It ain't right that the reader is smart and the listener is dumb. Listening is as valid of a way to consume information, and it has a longer human history than reading does. And that was a paradigm shift that helped resistance. And then later in my life, it was another therapist, where I was, still struggling with mental health challenges in my mid-20s, who said to me, his name was Alex, and I use mostly pseudonyms in the book, but Alex is not one. And he says, look, I think you're valuable, not despite, but because of your differences. And what a transformation, because when we say despite, and it's so common to do that, oh, hey, Jonathan, you're successful despite your dyslexia. That again implies that the problem's in the person, and the person should overcome their deficit of normality, right? But when we say because, it gets us to that place where there's a link between difference and value to the world. And if we keep saying despite, oh, hey, that person's smart despite autism, or that person has something to contribute despite ADD, or despite Down syndrome, or despite. When we say despite, we're playing into the rebranded eugenics game. Because when we say despite, then the autism, the ADD, the dyslexia, the manifestation of living or learning differently could be done away with. When we say because, we're now implying direct value because of a particular form of human diversity. And so that's been my mission, man. Not dyslexia, dysteachia, not despite, but because. And it's a fulfilling way to spend one's time on earth, to be out there trying to tell young people, their parents, their teachers, their employers, policymakers, that there is value in these states of being that we have historically pathologized and attempted to eliminate. And we need to activate that value more than ever, because there's also a ethical value in forms of human difference, a better way to live, and a better way to organize our systems of living that we all can learn from, as long as we can get past this notion that there's a normal and then there's a not.
It's not just socially inclusive, it's socially progressive, because when I hear you say the word despite, and changing that to because, I love you despite your challenges, or I love you because of everything that makes you you. It's not just inclusive of that person's difference. It also acknowledges that the multiple pathways that we take to solve problems are important. If we always solve problems, if everyone solved problems identically, there would be no innovation. There would be no possibility of finding new solutions to new problems, because if we keep using the same pathways, those pathways can be useful for certain problems or quick questions or issues in the world, but might not be as useful for other problems and other issues that we have yet to encounter. And going back to what you were saying, that at the core of this pervasiveness of normality in our thinking, we see difference as deficiency, not only in terms of individuals, but also in terms of communities, the way in which we can traverse intercultural communication, but also, and I think you were alluding to this a little bit, in terms of how we see the rest of nature, because there really is this drive to normalize one way of extractive consumption in the world. And there's a complete disrespect of biodiversity, which will likely be to our own demise.
I was reading a beautiful book, and I'm terrible with names, but it was a book based on regenerative agricultural practices in the Lake District of the UK, and it was a personal memoir of a multi-generational sheep farmer who grew up there. And what was interesting about this memoir, many things beautifully written, was his story of being told that he wasn't smart, his grandparents weren't smart, his neighbors weren't smart in an academic sense because they weren't good at reading and writing, and his journey to sort of reclaim a more indigenous intelligence, a more practical intelligence, as intelligence, not as nice to have, but as a form of human flourishing. And then at the same time, his practical advocacy to resist the factory farming that was happening in the area. And factory farming is the perfect microcosm of how norms and normal are intrinsic to industrial production. The word normal, as we know from the good folks who wrote, Normal a Genealogy, really emerged within a sort of industrial revolution context in which there was an imperative economically to standardize production around norms and standardize humans to fit that standardized production. And the notion of factory farming is all about norming the land, micro crop production, units of size, units of scale, and it's death. And there's no other word for it. Yeah. It's death to the land. It's death to the birds that used to populate the land. In the Lake District of the United Kingdom, migratory birds have been depleted by 50% or more because of factory farming practices that have led to a monoculture opposed to a diverse culture. And we need to start thinking about normal as a central piece of injustice, a central construct that has perpetuated injustice for generations now. Injustice against Black and brown folks, injustice against LGBTQ plus folks, injustice against folks with atypical brains and bodies, and environmental injustice. And when we can start thinking about the way that concept of normal has threaded through that history of marginalization for so many constituencies, we can start to resist, not in the form of identity politics only, but in the form of a reimagining of what it means to live and what it means to work and what it means to learn and what it means for us to regenerate and heal the planet that we live on right now.
Beautifully articulated, and I can hear listeners at home saying, yes, yeah, because you're absolutely right. It's a divisive concept. And in fact, the whole concept of seeing marginal as bad comes from seeing normal as good, right?
Yeah,
and the story of monocrops is very scary. We see this in palm oil production. We see this in corn production. We see this in all sorts of, in Australia. The crazy thing about Australia is our 4 biggest crops are the 4 most water consuming crops you can, like, in a country that has 1% water. Like, and biodiversity is incredibly important. Like, if you look at the indigenous land management that preceded European colonization, it was diverse. It didn't recognize 4 seasons. In many groups, they recognized between 7 to 11 different seasons, depending on the different bugs that would emerge throughout different periods of the year. And just the recognition of that greater diversity, that more nuanced understanding of, it's the season to eat bananas, it's the season to eat something else. Now you get bananas all year round at the supermarket, and that's strange. There's something strange about that. And what do we know about bananas? Well, being a monocrop is threatening to them. Where did avian flu come from? Where did swine flu come from? It came from the incubators that we've created in these factory farms. And so normality can be a source of viral infection as well, or microbial, an incubation for microbial disease as well. So even though it seems far-fetched, I'm completely with you that at the core of racial injustice, of gender discrimination, at the core of environmental injustice, we have this problematic framework of thinking based on the concept of normality. What, in your imagination, or in your thinking, what are the questions we should ask about normality?
Where does it come from? Who benefits from it when it's used? How has it been embedded in our systems? What practical sort of implementation, sort of a la Foucaultian analysis around the genealogy of concepts through the activation of those concepts in our systems? And how has it impacted our language and our sense of self, of who we are and who we should be? And that latter is a personal question, because it's important for us to think about how this notion has bared down on us and informed how we think about the good life, a good life, a meaningful life. And those questions are important always. They're important even more so as, normality is being beamed into folks' heads on Instagram. And we saw in the whistleblower papers that were leaked about Instagram in the United States and the testimony in front of Congress, how that impossible ideal that's existing in social media, the curated photos, the edited photos, has specifically impacted young women's mental health and increased suicide ideation. Because you're right to say it's a trickster. You said it's a trickster, the concept. It's a trickster because it tells us that different is deficient, when the reality is that different is valuable. But it also is a shapeshifter, because our algorithms of oppression, the title of a really important book, and if any listeners don't know it, I highly recommend it. Our algorithms of oppression are powered by norms that just keep regenerating themselves. So when somebody modifies their body to fit the previous impossible ideal of the human body, well, the goalpost is going to be moved again. It's a horizon that's put in front of folks for consumer reasons, so that we keep consuming to fix something that's supposedly wrong with us. And then the horizon moves again, because if you chase the horizon, you never get there. So where does it come from? How has it been used? Who benefits from it? And how is it bearing on your language, your thoughts, your sense of what a good life is? And can we turn to communities that have developed knowledge about how to live a better life outside of normal? You mentioned the indigenous pre-colonization agricultural practices. That's knowledge. The knowledge of the disability rights movement, of folks who live not with the myth of the perpetually improvable human body, but with the fallible human body. Those folks have knowledge to teach all of us. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So can we be bold and seek out learnings and lessons about a way beyond normal? Can we design our systems not around normal, but around the reality of human difference from that knowledge? That's our work together.
Your words are like air. I'm breathing them in. I think whether you see yourself as normal or not, those questions are important, because in disrupting normality in your own life and disrupting normality in the lives of others, we create a better life for everyone. If we make a world that is safe and enriching for people with needs, we create a world that is enriching and fulfilling for everyone. And that's why liberating one group of people from the algorithms of oppression is actually liberating ourselves. And so I'm totally sold on this project. And I just want to deeply thank you for writing a really fantastic book, and for paying it forward, and for your time today to share your insights about normality on Idioms of Normality on Future Framed TV.
Well, thank you so much. And, let's remember, the only normal people are people you don't know very well. And once you get to know another human being, not for who they should be, but for who they are. And once you get to know yourself, not for who you should be, but for who you are, it's difference that constitutes our humanity. So thanks so much for letting me be a part of your amazing project, your whole communities, paying it forward. We do this together, and I appreciate it.